everyone. And we're live. Georgi Dinkov, Ray Peat. Ray, how are you? It's been 2 months, feels like forever. Catch us up on everything that's going on with you.
I'm good. My voice is pretty much recovered from the laryngitis.
And I mean, do you think it's just the stress of everything and the winter? I mean, I'm in a pretty cold house right now, and it's I've had to make a lot of adjustments just because of how cold it is.
I think what started it was eating some bacon that was cured with celery juice powder. It's a very allergenic material, and I think it gradually built up into a generalized allergic reaction that was like an intense cold as far as my voice was concerned.
And you're really somebody, the only people I know, or person I know, talking about how really terrible the food supply is and how so many allergens that people think might be benign or not that harmful can cause serious symptoms like you're describing.
The market is full of phony good solutions to problems that never existed. Very intense salt, sodium chloride, is fine for curing pork, making bacon. You just have to then soak some of the salt out of it to make it ready to eat. But many years ago, they found that a little bit of the sodium or potassium nitrate or nitrate would give it a pink color and suppress bacteria growth. And so that became the rule. But then when someone discovered that it could be carcinogenic in very large amounts, some crops, I forget which the worst ones are, but if there's a heavy nitrogen fertilizer in commercial vegetable crops, the vegetable becomes carcinogenic because of the extreme amount of nitrate and nitrite it contains. So to create an alternative market, someone took the powder, the juice of these toxic industrial crops, and dehydrated the powder, found that the vegetable juice contained enough nitrate and nitrite to produce the pink color that people want in ham and bacon. And so that has become very popular now as supposedly a safe bacon, but it has exactly as much nitrate and nitrite as the bacon and ham made with the pure chemicals, but it also contains the complex, extreme allergens that some of these plants have. Celery juice happens to be on the edge of toxic ordinarily, even if you aren't allergic to it. But if you're allergic to it, then it can become extremely harmful.
Well, the great news is we don't have to worry about the additives they're putting in the meat because nobody will be eating meat anymore soon.
Yeah.
So, Ray, everybody's just dying to hear your current thoughts. I know we talk about it every single time, but that's like the primary question everybody's always asking me, like what is new, what is happening, and what is your, or maybe we can even back up a little bit. Like what is going on if somebody was clueless as to what was happening? Like what is going on right now?
In the winter and spring of 2020, I was saying essentially nothing is going on at that time. Nothing unusual was happening in the world health condition. But the only thing that was happening was a gigantic highly organized scheme to convince people, to scare people that some deadly new pathogen was circulating. And I forget which newsletter it was, fairly early in 2020. I described my interpretation of part of the background was that for all through 2019, the germ warfare lab at Fort Detrick kept announcing that it was having spills leaking their designer viruses into the environment, and finally, the parent agency, I guess it was Department of Health and whatever, that shut down what had been known for decades as the germ warfare laboratory. And for them to have all of these little stories put into the press over a period of a few months, and then to take the step of closing the whole germ warfare laboratory, I took that to be very significant. Ordinarily, they completely cover those up, don't have press releases that viruses might be leaking into the environment around Fort Detrick. And then that summer, there were cases of novel pneumonia that were blamed on the chemical cigarette substitutes, but they resembled in some ways the virus that later was known as COVID. And then the military, the annual, I think it's annual military games between nations was taking place in Wuhan. Early fall, I think it was September or October, and the athletes, ordinarily the army or military athletes, are made up of people training as Olympic competitors who use the military as a way to keep their amateur status. And this year, 2019, the Americans were ridiculously incompetent athletes. The historical worst showing of American military athletes since the games had been done. And someone who had worked at Fort Detrick interpreted that the same way that I did, that following a string of highly publicized leaks from the U.S. germ warfare lab, then having the military circulate among the Chinese in the military competitions, and that just happened to be before the supposed leak from Wuhan. So to anyone who knows the history of American germ warfare, that being so open and public about the connections seemed like any sensible potential enemy would have to consider the possibility that the U.S. Was actually preparing a release in China of their engineered viruses from Fort Detrick. The Chinese, I imagine, would have interpreted that about the same way I and many others did, that this was an ambiguous announcement that there could be a germ release in China, but it was so clumsily publicized that the enemy wouldn't want to take a chance that maybe it was going to be a real release. They should take some precautions, assuming that it's more than a propaganda scare. So that would account for China being ready, having months of announcements, ambiguously making them think there could be a release. So they were highly organized in the way they responded, but their response was extreme, more than anything they had ever done. Although it on the surface looked probably like it was a test, an activation to see what China would do, and maybe if China was extreme in their lockdown, then China would be something to copy around the world. And I think it was within a few weeks of the Wuhan military games that there was a worldwide meeting in New York, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation, Johns Hopkins University, and many other world powers, philanthropists, and so on. And in that meeting, they worked out a model of how governments should respond to the release of something like a COVID virus coming in from, in this case, they suggested that South America pigs had spread it through Africa to the United States. But it was a detailed program to reorganize the world, and the Rockefeller Foundation had, I think, the earliest explicit outline of the things that would have to be done in such a case. And one of the articles was on lockstep, but basically all three of their scenarios showed that the only prevention of the world catastrophe that they had imagined in this event 201, the New York meeting, that the only all three of their proposals involved destroying the old economy to be replaced by an artificial intelligence economy. And that was expressed by Eric Schmidt, formerly of Google and related corporations, but at the time working for an artificial intelligence anticipation committee of the Pentagon. And early in 2019, he gave this talk basically saying that the only way to save the world economy was to destroy all of the existing or legacy economies and to prepare for basically the monopoly, giant corporations to take over the world economy to save it as the old economy was being destroyed.
So the same thing as the Vietnamese village, the captain who had to destroy it to save it from the Viet Cong?
Yeah, and this was being delivered from all directions. Universities, the Pentagon, all of the big foundations had exactly the same story, and it was all coming out in the 5 years before the actual event, which was no event at all. But the preparations were becoming explicit 5 years. 10 years actually. The Rockefeller Foundation scenarios were in 2011, I think it was.
Go ahead.
Who, me?
Oh, no, I thought Ray was going to say something. Were you going to say something, Ray?
I was going to say that, I mean, at this point, at least in the United States, seems like the narrative is done. I mean, they may try to push the mandates, but currently they're on hold. So everybody around me, even in D.C., which is probably the city that was, most behind the mandates, and they were for the lockdowns and everything else, and the vaccines, and now nobody's even wearing masks anymore on the street. So where do you think this is going?
Luckily, we're not going there as fast as all of the ruling class had hoped. The Klaus Schwab, the founder and president of the World Economic Forum, at the very beginning of the pandemic, he said, we were having a lot of success changing the world through the fear of global warming. But he said that was promising to take at least another 5 or 10 years to replace the old economy because it had to go through legislatures. But he said, now this health crisis gives us the great opportunity to move directly into the reset using the authoritarian powers of government health boards so that you don't have to convince the public to elect representatives who will shut down the economy to prevent so-called global warming. He said now we can do it in just a year or two because of the direct controlling power of the health agencies.
Well, what is that new artificial intelligence economy that Schmidt was babbling about? I mean, I know what he said, but I work in that industry, continue to work in industry, and the whole premise of AI that at least their vision for it, taking over and replacing these workers, it's nowhere near what is being advertised. I mean, at best, it can do maybe 10% of what's been promised.
Yeah, they're still hoping that it will quickly come along according to their plans. But you can see within weeks, Amazon, for example, was making billions of dollars more than previously, just because if you close down local businesses all over the country, then people have to shop online. And in Eric Schmidt's talk early in 2019, he said shopping online is a valid recreation. You'll love it. But before it had happened, he was saying aesthetically it's wonderful and you'll enjoy the new world. While Klaus Schwab was, it sort of backfired, but for a while their slogan at World Economic Forum was, "You will own nothing and you'll be happy."
Yeah, except them, right? They will own their jets and fly around, but not us.
Yeah. They didn't say who was going to own everything if you aren't.
Okay, well, one of their giant plans, was work to some degree, because so many people are vaccinated now. So how does what you just said tie into everybody getting vaccinated?
The layers and layers of, since the vaccine doesn't work at all as a vaccine and reduces antibodies for maybe 6 months, then you have to get new injections. First, it was you need a third injection, but since that lasts only 6 months, you need a fourth and then a fifth. And meanwhile, the taxpayers are paying many billions of dollars to the people who are selling these toxic injections. And so far, since the law was passed in 1986, that the providers of vaccines can't be held liable for anything that happens to the vaccinated person. They're happy to keep receiving tens of billions of dollars from the government to keep producing their vaccines, and that will go on. It will become an annual or even more often than annual affair to update your vaccine.
So we're moving towards a model of mandated consumption of services and products, basically?
Yeah, it's the same idea that they've been doing for years in regard to transportation. You are legally required to insure yourself if you have a car license. And with the insurance, health insurance, the Obama Act mandated that everyone had to buy insurance or else pay a fine to the government. So it was a very small version, the government supporting an industry by simply requiring everyone to buy car and health insurance.
Do you think if the mandate for the vaccination fails, they may turn around and say, you know what? We couldn't make it mandatory, but here's the thing. If you don't vaccinate, we'll cancel your health insurance. We'll force your employer to cancel your health insurance.
I didn't hear.
I mean, I said because Biden's mandate is now at least temporarily suspended. Two courts have ruled that basically there are grave constitutional concerns, there are multiple practical concerns, et cetera, et cetera. And if, let's say, this mandate through OSHA fails, do you think another option for the government would be, okay, if we can force the companies to vaccinate people, we'll basically, because now there's the Obamacare Act, and the government is kind of standing behind the whole insurance business, they will basically tell everybody who is not vaccinated, you can no longer, it will cancel your insurance plan.
Yeah, things like that. I think moving quickly towards more and more direct control. Digital currency is one of their goals, so that there's no business going on without the authorization of the banks and the government.
Ray, what kind of emails are you getting from people being injured by the vaccine?
That's now probably 10 to 1 more often than what can we do to protect against a viral infection, what to do after you've been poisoned by the vaccine, and listing the kind of symptoms you're experiencing.
In those symptoms just being the result of the activation of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, do you think?
Yeah, sometimes directly following the vaccine, other times things such as bleeding episodes, sudden series of nosebleeds or dysmenorrhea in women, babies even starting to have vaginal bleeding. That is apparently being produced by the shedding of the vaccine material, putting the spike protein into unvaccinated people from the vaccinated people.
How big of a concern do you think that is? I mean, would that effectively make staying unvaccinated almost pointless, because if everybody around you is, then they'll shed it on top of you too?
The worst shedding fades out after the first few weeks, and so hopefully that amplification through shedding shouldn't get out of control, but it's enough to make a person want to avoid crowds for a long time.
So basically, since they're now planning for this to be a booster every 6 months, maybe every 6 months the unvaxxed should self-quarantine?
No, I think they should get together and insist on quarantining the vaccinated people for at least a month.
Yeah, let's see how this happens. I would love for this to happen, but I don't see it happening.
Ray, what if your significant other was vaccinated? Like, would you think the companionship and love would be worth the inhaling the spike protein?
I think I would keep my distance for a few weeks.
And then, do you suspect they might have a placebo group? Like, this is a big, gigantic experiment, you know? And do you think not everybody is getting the same vaccine?
No, I think the more or less insiders, you don't want to have famous people disappearing, dying, or having a stroke after getting vaccinated. And so I think they are very selective in avoiding giving anything but a pure water injection to the great majority of the prominent public figures.
Those unlucky
wasn't there
players.
some kind of a ruling, I don't know if it was a presidential order, but something about presidents of the United States are never to receive medical procedures live on air in front of the entire public, just because of no matter how minute the chance is, if the president croaks or gets an anaphylactic reaction and whatnot, that would have devastating consequences and it could trigger a collapse, right? So I would take it with a big grain of salt if a president of the United States is taking the vaccine live on TV. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, not just the president, but probably something like 80 or 90% of people who are very, very public.
And it feels like at the beginning of the year, we're talking about like, should pregnant women get vaccinated? And now it's 5 to 10-year-olds or whatever. And then Fauci just said babies and newborns should get it. Like, did I just make this up? Does it take 30 to 50 years to figure out like the side effects of any given drug or vaccine?
Yeah, at least 50 years, because it can be transgenerational. Cancers take 20 to 40 years generally to develop, but like the DES babies of the 1950s, their children, three and four generations after the DES exposure, are still developing that range of unique cancers, reproductive system cancers.
And do you have any theories on how they'll cover up kids getting myocarditis and dying after being vaccinated?
By not investigating them at all. People like Fauci just say the vaccine is perfectly safe, nothing's happened. They don't do autopsies. They don't do official investigations while the VAERS report of harmful effects from vaccinations, while those reports, which are even more time consuming to do, so that most doctors don't want to waste hours filling out the reports, even as difficult as it is to file a vaccine injury report, the graph showing all of the deaths from the major vaccines going back 10 years or more are minimal compared to the last 2 years since the vaccine. It's at least 100-fold increase in these reports, but they are not happening according to the government because no one is investigating and doing the statistics on them. A few individuals, a businessman named Kirsch has a good video showing you how to go into the VAERS system and look at their data. And the graph he prepared is ridiculous. It's a flat line in preceding 10 or more years. Suddenly, the line zooms up very vertically, so it's 100 times as much per year, or more than 100 times.
So what do you think is next in store for the, let's say, just for the U.S.? Because again, I mean, what I'm seeing around me, and I don't even mention more Republican states, I don't think the COVID narrative works anymore. So something must replace it because people are not afraid of it anymore enough for them to accept further encroachment of, of their so-called rights, whatever remains of them.
I think they're working on many alternatives. They're talking about the things that could happen to the economy apart from a pandemic, but a lot of ideas are waiting that could be sprung on us anytime.
Do you think a possibility will be, I mean, they'll basically crash the economy, literally the stock market and everything else, and they'll say, hey, look, it was because of the virus, but now the damage is so severe, no amount of bailouts will help, so we'll just have to, you'll just have to accept this new model that we have, or we're all toast. They'll just basically tell you the direct story, but the excuse will be different.
Yeah, that's their business, making up scenarios through which they can take over absolute power.
Speaking of scenarios, the Event 201 that you mentioned, I didn't know that Avril Haines was there, and she was like the director of the CIA. That's pretty
Deputy director.
And that was in Ray. I know you mention him very frequently, but Robert Kennedy's, I think his new book. He mentioned that.
Yeah, I've read about a quarter of the book. It's a very, very fat book with extremely small type, so it's slow reading. But he does a good job of tying together all of the things that are behind the virus conspiracy. It goes very deep into the military as well as economic and education.
How is his book still being sold on Amazon? That seemed a little bit odd that they wouldn't just immediately take it off.
Yeah, I'm hoping that enough people are buying the book to eventually even get it onto the New York Times best-selling list.
Is there any part of... Go ahead, Georgie.
So let's say enough people are already aware of what's going on. Let's say at least half the country knows, right? I mean, we'll see what happens in Europe. I mean, I think the people there also know, and now they're starting to riot, and then the police is starting to use live bullets, on people like in the Netherlands and potentially now in Austria and in Germany. So, I mean, do you think that's basically the only way out? I mean, people rise up and we'll have to accept that not all of us will make it, but basically it's at a breaking point, and going through courts, political systems, etc. It's really pointless, it seems.
Yeah, that's been the situation with any fundamental change. The establishment will always come up with something that looks like a change, but isn't at all, to distract the voting public from putting real change into effect. The antitrust acts early in the century were given so much publicity. Many people in the public believed that the government was on their side and was fixing the damage done to the public by the monopoly organizations. So when they broke them up, that calmed the population for decades. But it turned out that they didn't reduce the profits made by the monopolists and didn't decrease the rip-offs paid by the consumers. So the antitrust acts were a show.
Wasn't that true with Standard Oil as well?
Yeah. The same people owned it, but they just had different companies.
Completely off topic, but Ray, have you ever seen Everything a Rich Man's Trick, the documentary?
What was the name?
It's Everything a Rich Man's Trick.
Is what a rich man's trick?
Everything.
The documentary is called... Go ahead.
Yeah, basically that was what I was saying.
Sorry, go ahead, Ray.
The government is run by the ruling class, ultra rich, and so instead of doing anything to harm the ruling class, periodically the government is used to put on a show that they're going to knock down the ruling class. But that's that's exactly a scheme of the ruling class to preserve its position. Roosevelt said his economic reforms were the only thing that would save his class.
I'm totally blanking on the family's name, but it was like a Russian family. And there were people that overthrew this family in Russia, and they took them into like late at night, and they took them into a room, and they basically killed the whole family. And that was like a message to these ruling class families. They're like, well, we should subdue the population because we never want this to happen to us. Does any of that ring any bell at all? It was like some famous thing that sent a message to various ruling classes in different places.
Yeah, Pol Pot, for example, his idea of the ruling class went far beyond reality, and he was ready to kill everyone.
Apparently, it was Tsar Nicholas. Did that ring any bells? Or the Romanovs?
But that's what the revolutionaries did, right? They rounded up the Tsar family and killed them all except the youngest son.
Yeah, like this movie starts off with that killing being this big point in time. Anyways, okay, Ray, with your newsletter, is there anything we didn't touch on that you think is critical? Because I think we just talked about basically what your last newsletter was about.
Which newsletter?
What was it called? Immunology, Ideology, and Power.
Pretty much that's what we've been talking about. The power of creating a phony concept of immunity. Had we talked about the role the antibody theory of immunity has played in creating big pharma?
Touch on that, because I know you mentioned in the newsletter.
Yeah, the German chemical industry supported Paul Ehrlich's experiments using dyes, first heavy metals, arsenic, mercury, and bismuth, to kill pathogens. But when he showed that dyes had some of the specialized toxic properties of the heavy metal poisons, he used that a mere harmless dye supposedly would have these specific staining properties you could see under the microscope, that the pathogen would change color under the dye, and the host tissue wouldn't be stained or killed. And so he used the chemical dye industry and his argument of specificity, the magic bullet doctrine, that a chemical drug medication should have the ability of the magic bullet to seek out, attach itself to the pathogen, and not harm the host healthy tissue. It became very dominant in the cancer industry, but it spread. It really created big pharma when the dye industry took over with derivatives of dyes, following the staining specificity idea of Paul Ehrlich. And for them, the perfect definition of a magic bullet was our antibodies, which had a fairly good ability to stick only to certain things hopefully external pathogens and to inactivate them. But this was blended with the pharmaceutical ideal that every disease has its chemical treatment of an absolute specificity. Supported the reality of it was that yes, you can create specific antibodies that are very protective and specific against the specific antigen that evoked the antibody. But it was a general idea of individualized, specific attack against the pathogen, ignoring the healthy tissues. And the fact that he shared the 1908 Nobel Prize with Metchnikoff, Ehrlich used the opportunity of giving the lecture, Nobel lecture, to sell the idea of drug specificity, the essential basis for supporting a huge drug industry. And in Metchnikoff's talk, the only chemical treatment he mentioned that he knew of that really helped control or cure disease was quinine. And quinine is a natural substance. It happened to have a broad spectrum of benefit, acting somewhat as a tonic to the host, as well as an inhibiting action on a variety of organisms. But the Metchnikoff Nobel lecture didn't form the basis for creating any kind of industry. And so everyone just forgot about the facts that he described from the things involved in making phagocytosis possible all the way to the other end of the involvement of antibodies. But since there was no industry yet able to deal with the extreme complexity of the actual immune system, the actual immune system was dropped out of science after the Nobel 1908 lectures. And by 1920 and 1930, vaccination and the development of antibodies became a staple of medicine, and it was analogous to all the rest of medicine provided by the growing pharmaceutical industry. Everything having to have a unique one chemical, one disease treatment, so that in effect, as you could identify something as a sickness, it increased the market constantly for drugs that were specific for that sickness, rather than something like quinine with an extremely broad spectrum of effectiveness. They were creating thousands of specific drugs, most of which turned out to be more toxic than beneficial.
There was a British writer, I'm blanking on his name, who basically wrote once that the British Empire conquered the tropical nations, not because of its military acumen or its power or even money, but because of its incredibly healthy tonic water, which was made with a lot more quinine than the one nowadays.
I think the strongest of the tonic waters available have only 70 or 80 milligrams per liter.
Just to wrap up this thought, what the quinine is, a electron withdrawing agent helping to stabilize the flow of electrons?
I think that's a basic part of it. It turns out that almost anything bitter tasting has an activating effect on our innate immune system.
Do you have any hypotheses like why that is?
I didn't hear that.
Do you have any theories on why that is?
I think it's the organism's recognition of chemical generality in the world, and we develop tastes that usually cause us to eat high carbohydrate foods, for example. Depending on our needs, our appetites change. But I think when sickness is developing, the tastes change, and people start getting more interested in bitters. Digestive bitters, for example, are a very old general treatment for everything.
In the Eastern European folk medicine, bitter compounds are used for infectious disease and as anabolic agents. Before the athletes had access to isolated steroids, some of the earliest weightlifting athletes in Eastern Europe and Russia were using local herbs like Tribulus terrestris, which is extremely bitter in taste, and they didn't even know what it contained, but it was. There's some articles, older articles that are written in Russian that say that the bitter tasting herbs tend to have anabolic effect. Do you think there's some truth to that?
I haven't seen that older stuff, but there's a lot going on now with the biological meaning of the receptors for bitter tasting substances.
So they tend to stimulate some sort of a detox system in the body, it seems?
Yeah, apparently.
Fantastic stuff. So let me just do a quick advertisement here. The newsletter is available by email now. It's $28, which can be paid through PayPal at raypeatsnewsletter@gmail.com. And then they can also purchase your books there in digital and then physical copies as well, right?
Yeah, as long as there are physical copies.
Which ones are not available right now?
I don't remember.
So email Catherine to figure it out. And then also email Catherine at Kenogen@gmail.com. Each bottle of Progest-E is 3,400 milligrams of progesterone. And, I'm interested in these substances having a quick positive effect, but I'm also interested in them having like a person needing to trial and error different aspects of them. So, Ray, if somebody responds negatively to progesterone, like they have breast pain with it or something, what things come to mind as a possibility for that happening?
A very low thyroid functioning people are the ones who have that kind of reaction. If your thyroid is pretty low, even at 1 teaspoonful of the vitamin E solution, a teaspoonful of it isn't enough to achieve a progesterone effect.
Go ahead.
The first thing is to make sure your temperature and heart rate are in a good range because of having adequate calcium, vitamin D, and thyroid. Then you're sensitive to smaller amounts of progesterone.
And the progesterone is kicking the estrogen out of the cells and it's deactivated, but it can be reactivated if it passes through an inflamed tissue. Is that right?
Yeah, all of those circulating things are picked up in proportion to the inflammation. For example, one of the early detoxifying systems involves the liver's attachment of glucuronic acid to the substance to be excreted. But it turns out that if you stress a tissue, I tried many different kinds of stresses, low temperature, hypoosmolality, various kinds of irritants and so on. Everything I could come up with that stressed the tissue caused a tremendous increase in the enzyme that removes glucuronic acid from the substance. So your liver can be working very efficiently to detoxify it. But if something is locally irritated and inflamed, the blood passing through there will be subject to modification by the glucuronidase enzymes.
Very interesting. Georgie, do you have any other questions before I move on to Q&A?
And sulfatase as well. Like basically, if this estrogen has been turned into estrogen sulfate, now they've been showing that estrogen sulfate is the primary estrogen in menopausal women, even though all the others are low. And for a while, they thought that this is just a metabolic waste byproduct of estrogen that is being quickly excreted. But it turns out that it's not. And it's just like DHEA sulfate, estrogen sulfate is like a long-term storage form of estrogen that circulates and gets converted into estradiol in any tissue that is stressed or inflamed or, de-energized.
Okay, here's the first question. Who is the healthiest person Ray has ever known, and what does he think made them that way?
I've known lots of healthy old people who were hardly aware that they had a stomach or digestive organs. They just ate what was available. So a lot of it is the momentum that you inherit. And there are fewer people like that now than there were 50 or 60 years ago.
Before COVID, when you'd go to the grocery store and stuff, would you notice the millennial and Gen X and the Zoomer, how poor the health was of everybody?
Oh yeah. Just walking around town, you can see hormonal defects seem to be the rule rather than the exception.
Great stuff. Thank you for that. Okay. Does Ray have any thoughts on people's names influencing their behavior and personality? E.g., Raymond comes from Frankish Ragenmund, meaning council protection. And peat is a moss that was once an important fuel. So Ray's name more or less means protection of fuel.
Yeah, over the years, I've noticed probably more than 100 famous researchers whose name obviously connected, like Bird Whistle, the nonverbal communication researcher, or Dr. Drips, the menopause specialist. Bacon Chow, the nutritionist.
Do you think this is synchronicity, or there's some other influence going on here?
No, I think it puts it in their mind, arouses their interest eventually.
They got teased as a child, saying like, "Hey, are you going to be a doctor?" And then kind of stuck with them.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, here's one from James. He says, "Is having a good sense of humor as a sign that a person has a healthy metabolism? And are there health benefits to a sense of humor in humans and perhaps some other animals?"
Well, everything except the cultural influences are very similar between humans and mammals in general.
Do you think a sense of humor comes from having a good metabolism? Like how, I mean, you're very playful, Ray. I think you're hilarious. Like what, does that stem from your metabolism or the culture that you were brought up in, or what?
I think a little bit of either. With animals, you can see that simply the amount of well-being and energy drives the playing instinct. Cats, dogs, sheep. Sometimes sheep take a break from being normal and passive and just spend the afternoon dancing and frolicking and being silly.
Especially the lambs. Have you seen how they throw their legs in the air?
I didn't hear that.
No, I said especially the lambs. Have you seen how they throw their legs in the air out of pure joy?
Yeah, sometimes adults do that too.
Really?
Yeah. They're pretending they're antelope.
Great stuff. Okay, Ryan says, "Does Ray have any thoughts about handedness and its effects on personality and health? I'm reading that left-handed people have a higher incidence of chronic disease, autism, intelligence, etc. What is the nature of handedness?"
I think the high energy metabolism is pretty much the whole thing. As long as you have some fingers to work with. I imagine cats often envy a person for having such good fingers. They can see that the person can do something because of their anatomy that they would like to do. But apart from our physical shape limitations, I think the whole thing is the vitality that supports a big, hot brain and the excess knowledge that goes far beyond necessity and that leaves this huge area for playful exploration.
If I heard you right, there's no, like, if a person was functioning at an extremely high level, would they be ambidextrous?
I didn't hear that.
If a person, like, not on this planet right now, like, had a really high rate of metabolism, would they be ambidextrous and handedness wouldn't really be a thing?
To a great extent, yeah. The Russian experimenters found that handedness became extreme when neurosis was developed along with energy metabolism failing. The healthiest, in the sense of a big brain, females in particular, who have bigger brains in proportion to their body than males, these excess brain conditions are where humanness primarily exists.
Great stuff. Okay, this one is, what does Ray do to maintain a sense of novelty and wonder in his daily life?
Looking for it. Looking for novelty is probably the best way to find it.
And you do that by reading or watching nature or what?
Always possible.
Except watching TV, right?
Yeah, our TV burned out many years ago, right after the last of the so-called liberal programs. The guy who was Johnson's press secretary or assistant, he was the last token progressive or liberal on NPR, and the night they canceled his program, our TV burned out. No, we just haven't thought of TV since.
Speaking of liberal, I caught up with some of my family in Thanksgiving over the phone. And the strong liberals in my family, they hadn't even considered like that the vaccine would be deleterious to lower socioeconomic types. Like that wasn't even on their radar. Like a vaccine passport would exclude blacks that they apparently care like so much about, but they didn't ever intertwine the vaccine passport with what it would do to them.
Yeah, there are all levels of awareness about vaccines. Usually, the believers that people should be vaccinated are the ones who know absolutely nothing about immunity or innate immunity. Even the dissenting virologists, I've been listening to a lot of them. They have the best knowledge being discussed, but they're really heavily indoctrinated by the vaccine culture and the antibody culture.
But in another way, like BLM could be a great movement if they were actually against vaccination and activated. You know what I mean?
Say that again. I didn't hear all of it.
So the like the liberal people I know, they're very pro BLM, but what I meant is like if BLM protested against vaccines, they could actually be useful.
Oh yeah, but the motivation of the group seems to be very mixed. A lot of unprogressive, undemocratic people have kind of infiltrated the group.
Okay, next one.
How do you get your news, Ray? I mean, presumably mostly online. If the TV burned down, I'm guessing the radio followed through similar footsteps, and now what? Only computer or word of mouth?
Occasional rumors and books and things that the situation with newspapers used to be that if you looked for the contrary of what the current government position was, that would be where the truth was. So you would look for the opposite, and pretty much that's the situation with especially Google, for example. The Google system has been arranged to make it almost impossible to use ordinary search techniques to find anything useful.
There was a Hollywood movie back in, I think it was 2012. I'm blanking on its name right now, but a Nazi officer was interrogating a young Jewish girl that he didn't know it was Jewish, and he was asking her where all the Jews are, and she said,
Inglourious Basterds.
Yeah, was it Inglourious Basterds? Oh yeah, he was interviewing the father, a French guy who was hiding the Jews in the basement, and the Nazi said, "So tell me, where are all the Jews?" And the guy said, "Well, all I have is rumors. I don't have any facts." And the Nazi said, "Oh, I don't care about facts. They can be easily manufactured, but rumors can actually be quite revealing." So he seems to be agreeing with what you said, that you can kind of gauge the attitude and the direction of events just by listening to the rumors that the population is spreading around.
You still have to interpret the meaning. Who is spreading the rumor?
Great stuff. We'll let you go really soon here, Ray. Just a few more questions. And okay, so this one's from Jan. They say, Ray once said incidence of neurotic fatigue, anxiety, and depression increased along with IQ. Is it only related to energy and nutrient requirements, or is there more to it, e.g., culture, social, subordination, isolation?
The culture has what it will accept as the level of general intelligence and the behavior that follows. So that the going back decades, studies have found that the IQ of big organizations, the top IQ tends to be in the 120s. And my favorite study was at Oregon State University. In the psychology department, this person looked at the aptitude scores. They used the graduate, the Miller analogies test, which at that time was given to all entering graduate students. And the median raw score out of 100 for graduate students was usually in the usually in the 40%, 55 to 60% errors. That was the average graduate student score, except at Harvard it was more like 60 out of 100 right. At state universities, more like 40 out of 100. And this researcher then looked at their academic record compiled over the years after being admitted, and saw that the median score on the Miller analogies test was the peak academic success, the straight A's, successful academic career and receiving a degree. But exactly as the scores deviated upward from the mean or downward in proportion to the distance from the mean, the success academically declined. So people scoring in the 80s for example, were less likely to succeed than maybe someone with 100 or with a 40 rough score out of 100.
So in other words, the very smart and very dumb are unlikely to succeed in life?
Yeah. There are lots of variations on that, but it does seem to explain like the original IQ guy at Stanford. I forget his name, but he did one of the studies showing that the people in the 130s had very good academic careers for the rest of their lives. Those with 170 or 180 IQ were the ones constantly under pressure and sensing that they didn't belong.
Just two more here. Okay, so as a person's health improves, do they become more sensitive to stressors such as toxic smells, EMS, or bad food? Or since they are healthier, should those stressors not affect them as much?
One big difference is between men and women. The protective defense against toxins that would affect babies, for example, women are many times more sensitive than men. And it happens that estrogen is the sensitizer there, so that with the high estrogen of pregnancy, their sense of smell and nausea and repugnance increases.
If you do all these things, you know, you eat well for a period of years and you take thyroid and aspirin and progesterone, et cetera, if your brain got physically bigger and you were not providing it with everything that it needed, would you notice more deviations over time? You might notice little nuances about your body that somebody running at a way lower rate wouldn't notice?
Yeah, and there's been a heavy bias, you know, the idea that the brain stops growing at the age of, when I was in graduate school, it was 11 months from conception that the brain absolutely stopped growing, and it simply underwent some maturing changes like increased white matter in proportion to gray. People who have bothered to check a population over the years, doing detailed studies every 10 years. One study went on for 60 years and ended up when there were technologies making it possible to identify the amount of DNA per brain and so on, that found that in almost everyone, the brain substance was enlarging steadily with aging, and the skull shape changes predictably with aging, apparently growing a slightly bigger capacity of the cranium.
Thanks for that. And Ray, absolute last question. I get emails from people every day saying, Mexico, what about Mexico? Is it safe, et cetera? And so I know we've talked about it multiple times, but can you maybe reiterate your opinion on Mexico and it being possibly semi-immune from all the things that are happening?
Yeah, I was just reading about AMLO's challenge to his judicial system. A judge had ordered that the vaccine be made available to children a few weeks ago and set I think, a 5-day deadline. And he definitely opposed that. And there is still conflict going on in the government, but it looks like he's getting away with saying that the vaccine is too dangerous for children, but it's now available to children over 12 who have a chronic disease and are arguing that they need extra protection. But for the general population, he's not letting it become available. So I think that he personally is constantly judging how much he can get away with, and a lot of that depends on the foundations and the giant corporations and the U.S. government. If they become more focused in opposing him, he won't be able to keep doing it. But he, so far, has been knowing how to compromise well enough so that even Trump didn't threaten to invade.
And if AMLO was killed tomorrow, you said something maybe on the call a few months ago that like Mexico would retain its spirit. Like, can maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, the people who elected him, there are really a majority of Mexicans who are very progressive and who are conscious that the reason they haven't been able to go ahead is that the U.S. has intervened over and over, including the murder of President Madero and probably other candidates and presidents like Colosio. The U.S. is probably behind the direct intervention, short of military invasion. And so a big part of the population knows that they can't get away with fixing the economy quickly.
And then that's it for me. Ray, what are you working on right now?
The next newsletter is going to be around the idea of the menopause and that relating to the failure of energy with aging and what things are involved in the failure of energy, especially as it shows up during the menopause.
And Georgie, any final words?
Well, one last question. It was actually asked by the people in the list. I saw it. Whether Ray thinks there's any value to self-discipline and forming any sort of like useful habits, or do you think a person's best life would be lived spontaneously / intuitively?
Definitely spontaneity. You deaden your own energy if you force yourself to work.
Okay. So do you think there's any circumstance in life where basically one needs to sort of exercise the will, feeling that they don't like this, but they kind of have to do it? Or do you think it will be always detrimental?
Yeah. Sometimes you have to do something until you can survive without doing it.
So if it has a survival benefit, then it's worth self-disciplining about it, but anything beyond that is self-torture.
yeah, you should only do unpleasant things if you're really forced to do them.
Amazing. Ray, thank you so much. Georgi Dinkov, thank you. Thank you so much to our audience. These are always extremely fun to do. And Ray, thank you for donating 2 hours of your time here. Sincerely appreciate it. Stay on the line, and everybody have an amazing weekend, and we'll talk to you guys soon. And thank you for all the support of this show. Thank you guys so much. Have a safe weekend. Talk to you soon. Okay. Bye, everyone.